For the next 2 hours, you will have a story and the calm to fall asleep inside it.
Not with outrage, not with spectacle, only patient attention.
Maps confess when warmed, streets drift, rivers return, and a modest stamp says, "No drama." Talk sways, talk persuades. When the city practiced stillness, time listened and paused just long enough to learn its manners. Debt paid by silence, minutes restored. The story keeps its promise quietly.
Stay with me. Ask small questions. In the answers you'll
Before we begin, promise me one thing. Don't rush the silence. Let the stone breathe, let the pages settle. If the bells stir, keep listening. I'm ready to tell you what I swore to keep. I was taught to love silence the way a craftsman loves a tool, not for what it is, but for what it can make people do. Silence could tame a rumor, hold a scandal underwater until it forgot it was once air, turn fear into obedience, and obedience into a calendar that never needed to explain itself. They gave me vestments, woven with the same thread they used to bind books. They gave me passwords that sounded like prayers and keys that felt like questions. I kept all of them until the night one key warmed in my palm as if it too had a pulse and a memory and a long, tired patience that had finally run out. I will not tell you my birth name, because it has been filed next to feast days that no longer exist and saints who were edited to be more convenient than human. I will not tell you my title, because titles are masks made of brass, and brass reflects whatever fire stands closest. In another life, I answered to Father. In this life, I answer to whatever does not wake the house. Let me be only this: a former priest, a night witness, someone who can no longer afford the luxury of keeping other people's secrets. If you are listening, dim the room not because darkness is holy, but because it is accurate. Holy places are darker than you think. The stones remember rain more vividly than sunlight. The candles stand at attention like soldiers condemned to hold the same pose until they melt into their boots. Even the dust is disciplined. On the night it began, the dust did not move when I walked, it only listened. The corridor we used for midnight inventories had a name no one wrote down. We called it the Night Line in whispers, because all the other lines, the ones that divide hours from hours, faith from fear, truth from utility, seemed to knot themselves here. The tour routes stop 2 floors above it, where Latin inscriptions are polite and the air smells like tourism and novenas. But step past the velvet ropes and the air changes temperament. It thickens and turns iron-laced like the breath left behind in a smithy. Somewhere below the official crypts and their careful labels, a series of stone steps begins to behave as if it is tired of being loyal to the ground. I held the brass key in my right hand and a stub of candle in my left. The key bore a pattern small enough to be a superstition, a circle of dying moons, each carved thinner than a sigh. There was no lock on the door, because the lock was a habit. All of us had learned to keep this door closed by repeating the same stories about how doors were dangerous. We told those stories so often that the hinges forgot they could move. The habit had kept me faithful longer than the catechisms ever did. But grief is heavier than habit. Curiosity is sharper. and a year of wearing the same silence had worn the thread to daylight. On the doorframe, someone had marked 3 hash lines with a nail. The oldest was iron-colored and almost polished, smooth by the touch of robes. The next was brown and slightly raised, as if the wood had tried to heal around it. The newest was almost red. I was not the first to come here trembling. I would not be the last to leave shaking. This is how institutions breed, not through ceremonies, but through the inheritance of someone else's unfinished courage. When I slid the key into the inner iron and turned it, I expected the scrape of metal and the complaint of a faithful hinge. Instead, I heard something like a throat being opened after a long vow of silence, a sound more relief than pain. The door sighed inward. Cold air crawled up the corridor with the manners of smoke and the patience of arithmetic. It smelled like parchment that had cracked along the same line for 100 winters. It smelled like a cathedral coat after a funeral in the rain. It smelled, most of all, like old iron pretending to be forgiveness. You will expect me to tell you I was afraid. I was. Fear is a loyal dog. It follows you whether you ask or not. But alongside fear came a steadier companion, a sense that a ledger somewhere had been opened in my name, and a blank line waited patiently for me to write something honest on it for the first time. The candle seemed to lean toward the threshold, as if it had been taught to bow at certain doors. I stepped through. Inside, the light behaved like a student who had memorized rules and never learned wonder. It fell on what it was given. Iron rings bolted into oak tables, book spines armored in leather, the color of midnight bread, chains that looped through plates and posts so gently you might mistake them for jewelry until you heard the first link move. The sound of a chain shifting in a quiet room is the sound of a sentence deciding whether to end with a period or a blade. I heard it then, the smallest rearrangement of metal upon itself, a sigh of weight remembering gravity. There is a particular cruelty to chained books that photographs cannot deliver. It is not the iron. Iron is honest about being heavy. It is the implication. A chain tells you the book will not run. It will not misbehave. It will not betray the order of the room by migrating into a pocket or a coat. But a chain also tells you the book has reasons to run. Someone once feared its legs. You feel that fear under your fingertips when you open the cover and the chain lifts to accommodate the angle like a reluctant snake. I chose the blue-spined volume because its leather looked tired in a sympathetic way, as if it had been punished by being left alone in the dark, and had decided to forgive us anyway. On the cover, a sigil had been pressed, a halo with a blindfold drawn through it. The halo looked like an oath being strangled. I placed 2 fingers on it, because sometimes you have to touch disobedience to know whether it is breathing. Heat moved beneath my skin like a moth trapped between panes. The impression that reached me was not a word, but a direction, an arrow in the marrow. It suggested a wall that was not a wall, and a shelving unit that had not always been content to be perceived as such. I pressed the case along the bottom panel and felt an old latch consent to remember its job. Behind the panel lay an alcove scarcely big enough to accommodate the absence of a man. At its center waited a package wrapped in lead foil, sealed with wax so old the seal itself had become a fossil of a gesture. Wax loves to remember the shape of decisions. This one had decided, a long time ago, to keep the names inside from catching fire. When I cut it open, I found a ledger with pages pale as a stilled breath. Each entry had 3 columns, a name, a date, or what looked like a date, though some carried an extra moon scratched next to the numbers as if the date required an apology, and a 3rd column labeled Considerations. Half those lines were crossed with a crescent blade. I stared at the ink until my eyes ached inward. It was not a financial ledger. I can tell those from a room away. This was a book of memory who remembered, who forgot, who had been asked to forget, and what had been offered in exchange. In the margins, in a hand trained to be neat and ashamed of itself, someone had written, Pactum sub luna. Under the moon, agreements behave differently. I did not understand then. I understood too well later. The corridor behind me exhaled, as if a new animal had been let into the house. From the vault above, somewhere these rooms stack, like badly printed pages, each a little misaligned, came a murmur of steps. It was almost the hour of matins, when the day tries on a throat, but keeps its mouth closed. The brothers who loved the night more than they loved their own beds were already at their posts. I could picture them without needing to look. Cloaks heavy enough to have weather, shoulders stitched with a curve that refused to explain itself. Some walked the upper stone like cats that had learned patience from the geometry of roofs. Others kept a vigil over maps that had forgotten how to be faithful. All of them carried rosaries whose beads did not click like prayers but ticked like gears, measuring something more tender than time. We did not call them by their proper name in daylight. Daylight eats poetry. It strips uniforms of their teeth and chalks up their work to archive duties and inventory and guard rotation. But in the places where the walls sweat and the air tastes like a pencil between the teeth, we allowed ourselves the luxury of the right title, Moon-Beast Crusaders. They were not knights in the romantic sense. They were not librarians in the civilian sense. If I must be precise, they were editors of a world that refused to admit it was a manuscript. I was not one of them, not then. But they allowed me to learn because I was an obedient errand who had begun to move in the right direction. They taught me how to hold a book like a candle, how to hear the difference between a page turning and a page aging, how to tell whether a map was lying by counting how many streets it omitted while pretending to be generous elsewhere. They taught me there are 2 inventories in any holy place, one for matter, another for sequence. The first counts chalices and bones and gilded boxes with windows where saints are encouraged to behave like snow globes. The second counts things you cannot put in a drawer, hours and anniversaries, and the fragile etiquette by which memories agree to follow one another. On a table near the alcove, a parchment slept under a sliver of glass, heavy enough to flatten dissent. The ink glittered faintly, not like gold, which is too theatrical to whisper, but like powdered stone. Meteor ink, the old marginalia called it aerolithos. Words mined from a sky that was tired of pretending it could not be ground and made obedient to a nib. The scribe who had written with it had a hand like a violinist, controlled, lonely, incapable of tolerating a wrong note. The sentences had been composed for another century to overhear. They spoke of feasts moved not for convenience, but for leverage, of winters shortened like a haircut the public was assured would grow back the same, of a calendar corrected so carefully that the very concept of correct forgot it had ever been a synonym for acceptable. Next to that parchment lay a smaller folio, bound in hide the color of arguments. The fastening was a strip of brass with the patience of a teacher. Inside were lists where the left margin kept changing its mind. Some saints had lost feast days like soldiers losing ranks. Some had lost letters. Some had learned to answer to names that sounded enough like their own to be usable in sermons. The most unnerving page was labeled with a tact you only learn after a lifetime of refusing to name things plainly. Duplications. 2 columns of popes, one public and one private, with months braided between them like a rosary that thought itself a rail line. The script at the bottom was written in a disappearing ink so clever it hated itself. Exposure to sunlight unspooled the letters into evaporation. The note said only, "We will remember by moon, we will forget by noon." When you keep watch over 2 inventories, the one made of metal and the one made of sequence, you begin to hear the building itself choose sides. Stone prefers sequence. Wood prefers matter. Chains will vote for whoever keeps the floor from deciding to become a river again. That night, the stone leaned toward me, as if to suggest a path the architects had drawn by accident. I followed the coolness in the air, the way a child follows the smell of rain to a window. The narrow way curved and dropped, then narrowed further until I could feel history press its shoulder against mine, like a dog that has waited all day to admit it worried you would not return. At the end of the corridor, a second door waited with less pretense than the first. Its wood had not been polished into the kind of modesty that impresses donors. It had accepted its scars as handwriting. Across its face, moons had been carved in their waning phases, each thinner and lonelier than the last. A craftsman had loved this work. You can tell by the way the gouges keep their nerve. I pressed the key again. The iron remembered. The voice of the hinge was softer now. The voice of someone who knows you by the sound of your shoes. The chamber I entered did not announce its importance. Rooms that can afford their secrecy are never grand. They are efficient. They keep their treasures in reach of a tired hand. They smell like sap and arithmetic. A single stone slit admitted moonlight, thin as a blade's idea of mercy. In that meager light, an object near the far wall distinguished itself by refusing to reflect, a clock mounted without hands. Its face was so pale it seemed to be waiting to be decided. I moved toward it within the rules of old floors, the ones that punish haste with biography. When I stood close enough that my own breath fogged the glass, the clock exhaled back. The fog printed the shape of my lungs on the world. Later, I would learn the ritual. Crusaders returning from the roof would stand here and press their palms to the glass. The clock registered obedience, not by ticking, but by fogging. On certain nights, it pulsed once, just once, and every flame in the vault bowed toward it for the duration of a heartbeat. That was how they took attendance of the night, not in numbers, in consent. On a shelf beside the clock sat 3 objects so unassuming that I almost loved them for their lack of theatricality. A rosary whose beads hid teeth of gear inside, a conical vial of grit labeled Selenic, and a map case scored with cuts too neat to be accidents. I lifted the rosary because it fit the hand like a verdict. When I rolled the first bead under my thumb, a shy click confessed itself. Not a prayer, a mechanism. The second bead gave a soft answer. The third waited like a thought that wants a witness. I turned the ring halfway. The room altered, but not in the way that makes furniture scream. Rather, the sound of my own blood moved closer to the surface, as if the body had been convinced to lend its rhythm to the wall. The map case released a page with less reluctance than a patient removes a bandage. Chalk lines braided across the rooftops in meridians that did not care about property. Small crescents were inked where I knew no artisan would dare to place a ladder. Along the ribs of the great dome, the shoulders of statues that have acquired the courtesy of pigeons, the balustrades that teach tourists how to pretend they are not afraid of edges. Next to each crescent, a notation in a hand that apologized for being efficient. Tether here. Hold 4 rotations. Do not speak the first syllable of the angelic tongue unless prepared to hear your own childhood answer back. I did not sleep that night. Sleep is a confession you make to the day. I was not ready to confess. Instead, I wandered the shelves as if they were streets, in a city I had been promised as a child and only now granted a passport to walk. A hymnal, spine cracked by generations of throats, had been annotated with star positions. The notation was not astrology, not even astronomy. It felt like accounting. This note equals this brightness. Sustain for the length of this breath, and the constellation will hold. In the margin, a tired but dutiful hand had written, "Do not let the choir sing beyond the tolerance of the sky." I could hear it then, just barely the way a held note sometimes persuades a room to grow a second ceiling. By the time the first bell of matins trembled the dust, I had found the courage to sit at the central table with the ledger of considerations open like a wound that had learned how to be helpful. The entries that included a small crescent in the date were linked by a handwriting I had started to recognize. The captain of the Crusaders, though, at the time, I only knew him as a set of footsteps that did not apologize for existing, preferred to write with a nib that bit into the page as if each letter was a small, necessary violence. He recorded debts, not in coin but in lull. 3 nights missing from city registers. Bells rung but unheard. 4 children waking on the same street with the same dream. Convent garden blooming 2 weeks early, corrected by fasting and a minor scare. The ledger was a cookbook for a city that refused to admit it was too alive to stay obedient without a little editing. The bells did not crash so much as suggest that air could be organized. The sound reached the chamber with the manners of someone afraid of being scolded for enthusiasm. A shiver passed through the books, as if each remembered a line it had promised to forget, and had decided to honor that promise one last time before surrendering it to the court of mourning. Above me, muted through stone, I heard footsteps redistribute themselves onto roofs. The Crusaders had their routes. Those routes did not match the maps that day tourists buy. Their lines hum along ridges and behind statues and past vents that exhale a kind of winter even in July. The city makes a different kind of sense at night. It manages its own corrections. I rose, ledger balanced on my forearm as if it could feel shame, and did what I had come to do, but only now admitted aloud within myself. I wrote my name in the blank where the page had been waiting all along. Not my baptismal name, not the one the sacristan used when he needed something carried, not the one the world could pronounce. I wrote the name that fit me in this room, Night Witness. I added the date with a small crescent not because I had earned it, but because the moon had already noticed me and it seemed impolite to pretend otherwise. Under considerations, I wrote the first honest line of my adulthood. I opened the door. They trained me to describe instead of approach. Then I underlined it once. Underlining is a promise you make to a future you may not survive to occupy. If confession is supposed to be a relief, This was not that kind. Relief cools. What moved through me was warmer. It felt like embarrassment, except the person I had embarrassed was time. I closed the ledger and replaced the lead foil with the tenderness reserved for the bodies of saints no one is sure how to explain. I returned the blue book to its chain. I placed the map back into its tube as one returns a blade to a sheath without waking the sleeping house. When I finally turned to go, the hinge sang its soft ache again, and the cold of the corridor kissed my face with the lips of habit. On the way up, I paused where the stone remembers the hands of generations. There are places that become polished simply because hope is greasy. People drag their palms there not because they believe, because they are afraid not to. I laid my hand along that shine because it seemed rude to pass without acknowledging the bargain. The stone was colder than honesty and warmer than doctrine. In that temperature, I understood a small and irritating truth. The Night Line had not been hiding a room. It had been hiding me from myself. The world upstairs went about its business, as if night were a rumor and morning had pressed charges. The sacristan yawned through a set of keys that could unlock any number of obedient problems. A tourist tugged at a guidebook whose maps had been corrected to agree with the invoices of daylight. A nun carried a tray of cups with the steadiness of someone who believes plates and bodies and thoughts can be persuaded to do the decent thing if you call them by the right name. I passed among them like a ghost in training. If anyone noticed the dust on my sleeve, they did not tell the nearest authority about it. There are mercies even in institutions. You want me to tell you that I turned back immediately, that I fled to the safety of a smaller life with fewer rooms of knives disguised as calendars. I did not. The first sin of every zealot is to think his experience is reusable as doctrine. I had no intention of founding a church of one. I went back to my duties. I said the prayers the way a clock says morning. I folded linen with the reverence appropriate to cloth that would soon carry the weight of decisions disguised as bread. But each movement now carried a shadow I could not classify. The world had hidden a set of shelves in its ribs, and my hands had learned where one of the latches lived. Days behaved, as days do, by rushing toward the next obligation and pretending it is a destination. Nights behaved like conspirators who had already made peace with their own guilt. I learned the steps of the Crusaders by accident at first. A boot print on a parapet where no boot should dare. A chalk crescent whose curve matched exactly the angle of a thumb caught thinking. A folded scrap of paper in the gutter, inked with a pair of numbers separated by a dot and a moon. The numbers, I discovered, referred to a choir note and a street lamp. The lamp would flicker when the note was held long enough to be believed by granite. The flicker was not a miracle. It was an admission. In those weeks, months, what is time, in a place that edits it? I learned to list what I had once narrated. There is a difference. Narration is polite. Lists are efficient. I listed the ways silence is enforced. Chains, edits, feast days moved like furniture, saints recast as furniture, the way a clock can become an instrument of mercy if you teach it to fog for a handprint instead of demanding to be obeyed. I listed the costs of such mercy. Children who wake from dreams that feel like borrowed weather, gardens that erupt out of season and are scolded back into obedience by fasting. A city that quietly agrees to misremember certain nights so that the morning may arrive with its usual, rehearsed innocence. These lists did not absolve me. They trained me. The night I truly understood The profession of the Moon-Beast Crusaders arrived without theater. It smelled like dust that had learned Latin, and rain deciding whether to arrive. I was in the inventory corridor with a stack of hymnals that needed to be taught their manners. A shadow entered before the man. The shape of the hood was not a threat. It was a decision. He nodded at me the way a chess player nods at a pawn that has surprised him by surviving until the endgame. "You should not be here," he said, and the grammar was gentler than the content. I agreed and did not leave. He considered me for the length of a candle's tremble. "Then be here properly." He led me down the night line, as if the stones had been pinched up from sleep, and asked kindly to stand. In the chamber of the handless clock, 3 crusaders waited with their rosaries unfurled like tools laid out for surgery. The captain placed my hand upon the glass. The face fogged as dutifully as a mirror asked to prove a body exists. He nodded once, an encouragement offered to a child learning how to swim without the showmanship of drowning. "When you press your hand here after a patrol," he said, "you are not asking the hour what it is. You are asking whether it agreed to behave. It's milling." I wanted to ask what he meant by patrol. He spared me the humiliation of the question. "On the roofs," he said, "along the lines that hold the night to the stone. We lure it, where we can tether it, and we listen for the latch in the sky." He said, "Latch the way a locksmith says soul." He said sky, the way a scholar says book. He lifted his rosary and let the first bead click. The room hushed, but not out of fear, out of courtesy. "Each click is not a prayer," he continued. "It is a promise to measure. We do not ask God to change. We ask the night to remember it is rented." In wonderver, I do not know if you can imagine the relief of being told that the most frightening thing in your life is not divine wrath, but poor bookkeeping. It makes you bold in small, survivable ways. It turns terror into a checklist. It lets you live. That was the night I accepted my apprenticeship to a truth that had been all around me for years, like a wallpaper I had mistaken for theology. It would still be months before I would step onto the rooftop and learn how to walk the rib of the dome without baptizing the piazza with my body. It would still be longer before I would stand beneath a moon that had decided to behave like a gate and hear a language angels refuse on principle because it aches in places they were promised would never ache again. But chapter by chapter, breath by breath, page by page, I moved from visitor to witness, and from witness to something that cannot be named without waking the city. If you are still with me, loosen your jaw the way a diver does before the water admits him. The confession is only beginning. Doors, once convinced to remember how to open, do not forget. I have turned one such key. I will turn others. Tonight, we keep a small candle between us. If the flame leans, do not panic. The room is not moving. The world is making room for a story it had tried, in good faith and terrible efficiency, to keep from you. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced, and I had finally learned the cost of being the one who enforces it. The first rule of a vault is that it pretends to be smaller than what it guards. We build narrow doorways, not because we fear thieves with broad shoulders, but because we fear our own appetite for space. A narrow door suggests humility, and humility is cheaper than virtue. When I crossed back into the deeper rooms, the ones beyond the polite catacombs and their tourist Latin, the corridor, narrowed until breath became an act of filing oneself down to the essentials. This is how an inventory begins, not with a list, but with a posture. I learned to walk those aisles with my elbows tucked in and my head slightly bowed, not out of reverence, but to hear better. Shelves talk when they think you are not listening. Wood expands around iron in winter and sighs itself thin in summer. Pages murmur with a dry kiss that is the language of vellum, remembering it was once skin. Chains have a Morse code, the short clinks are impatience, the long ones are warnings. And candles, when they are honest, tell you what the air refuses to confess. On my third week of midnight inventory, I carried a single taper in a brass dish, polished by other hands, into a kind of institutional kindness. The wick had been dipped in beeswax too many times, so it burned with a sweetness that didn't match the stone. I liked the contradiction. It reminded me that softness erodes monuments faster than hammers do. My task that night was simple. Verify the presence and condition of 27 chained volumes in the aisle labeled Apocrypha of Spheres, and update the ledger with notes on binding, ink stability, and any anomalous behaviors. This last category was administrative vanity, our way of implying we had an agreed definition of anomaly. We did not. An anomaly is only a pattern that has not yet recruited enough witnesses to call itself law. The first book was titled in a neat, defensive hand, Devosibus Orbitalibus, on orbital voices. I had seen it before and liked it less each time, the way one likes a mirror less the longer it insists on being accurate. The author anonymous, which in these rooms was the surest sign of competence, argued that celestial bodies are not silent but choose their audiences. To a shepherd, the moon is polite. To a ship captain, it is utilitarian. To a crusader, it is an employer with strict hours and poor bedside manner. The marginalia are marginalia, added by a succession of night watchers who disagreed professionally debated which vowels the moon tolerates. Someone had written, O is a doorway, A is a wound, U is a tether. Avoid E unless you are prepared to apologize to a tithe. I recorded the binding as stable, the ink as purling at edges, a sign that the meteor dust was resisting humidity, and the chain as prematurely fatigued 2 links from the staple. Then the candle moved. Not the flames move. The candle itself slid a thoughtful inch toward the aisle's darker end. The brass dish rasped against the table in a sentence of small vowels. I stopped breathing for the length of a human agreement. Then I pushed the dish back, precisely where it had been, and waited. It moved again, no showmanship, only insistence. There are several explanations a sane man reaches for when the world misbehaves in a small, almost courteous way. Drafts come first. So I tested the air with the back of my hand and found it as consistent as a nun's handwriting. The floor? Old, yes, but not sloped. Rats? None. This pious... I exhaled and watched the flame lean, not toward a vent or a crack, but toward a particular spine halfway down the aisle, as if the wick had been enrolled in a course called Pointing at What Matters 101. The book it indicated was gray, the kind of gray that institutions cultivate to avoid making promises. It had no title, only a blind stamp of concentric circles that didn't quite agree on where the center should live. The chain was shorter than the others. Someone had decided it shouldn't enjoy even the illusion of mobility. When I opened it, the first page behaved like a held breath deciding to become language. There was no table of contents, only a list of contritions pretending to be chapter headings. On the forgiveness of seconds. On bells heard by clocks that refuse to strike. On moons that decline to be counted, on contracts made of thin, cold light. The script was uneven in an elegant way, like the coastline of a country that never learned to fear cartographers. I traced one of the headings with the flat of my finger, the way a child touches the name of a dead dog engraved on a garden stone, and felt the paper answer. Not warmth, not vibration. Answer. The sensation was that of a patient turning their face toward a voice they have decided might know the correct dosage. I read until the candle asked me to admit the existence of time. The chapter on the forgiveness of seconds argued that history cannot be altered by removing years. Not really. The human jaw is too stubborn. But seconds, those small sips, can be forgiven, seeded, reconciled. Remove enough of them at the right thresholds, and you can slip a procession through a city without any of the clocks acquiring incriminating memories. It was not about theft, it was about taxation. Time pays tithe. If you know where the tithe barn is, you can redirect the grain. The ledger required me to sign my initials beside any lively reaction. I wrote minor independent movement of light source toward item 14 inches, a hand that would look competent in court, and added, against policy, a single word, obedience. The candle was not curious. It was obedient to something older than draft and warmer than superstition. It wanted to be where the attention should be. Perhaps that is all a liturgy is. Training a room to want attention in the right place. Further down the aisle, I found the Meteor Ink manuscript that had first taught me the sky could be ground into cooperation. I angled the candle and saw the glitter behave less like ornament and more like fatigue-powdered stone, remembering gravity and deciding to imitate it for company. The marginal notes, which I had once dismissed as boastful, began to read like weather descriptions, not confessions, observations, not threats. 3 nights of fog persuaded to stay low, bells rung, heard by fog, not by registers. Children on Via del Grazie woke with the same dream, a door at the top of a staircase that did not want to be a staircase. Choir held F for 13 breaths. Lamps on the north colonnade flickered in a pattern resembling agreement. I copied the 3rd note into my pocketbook. Not for ritual theft, not to embarrass the ledger by duplicating its work, but because, sometimes, you must marry a thing to a smaller page to discover if it will keep its vows. Across from the Apocrypha of Spheres, behind a lattice meant to suggest boundaries without acknowledging fear, sat the Vatican cabinet, supplies for the last miles of a journey no one publicly admits exists. The key to its gate lived on a ring that pretended to be disorganized. It was a theater of jangling that flattered the man who wore it. I had noticed that the Vatican key was always a little colder than the others, even when it had warmed against a belly for hours. Cold is a kind of privacy. Inside the cabinet, the shelves were almost municipal in their pride. Everything labeled, everything believably dull at first glance. Chalk wrapped in oiled cloth, the kind that refuses to squeal. Hammered iron crescents too thin to be weapons, too sincere to be jewelry. Vials of grit labeled Selenic in a hand that hated adjectives. A coil of wire fine enough to pass for hair, wound around a wooden spool carved with the same blind halo I had felt under my fingers the night before. And, in a drawer that required 2 hands and 1 lie to open, a packet of hymns slipped single lines of notation with precise instructions on how long to hold a note before the air agreed to behave. I took a crescent and discovered that it had been sharpened along its inner lip with the patience of a confession, not to cut flesh, to carve chalk. The Crusaders drew on stone not because they believed stone enjoyed being decorated, but because stone is the only adult in the room, and adults must be given forms to sign before they agree to look the other way. They chalked crescents onto balustrades and ribs and statue shoulders to create tether points, places where the knight could be asked, politely and mechanically, to pause and consider its contract. The hymn slips were plainer than vanity would have demanded, which made me trust them. One read, "Hold low A for the length of grief at a kitchen table, release before pride." Another, "Let the vowel open like a door you do not plan to enter. Do not let the choir enjoy itself." I smiled, despite the air. Liturgical joy is a more dangerous drug than wine. Joy makes amateurs of professionals. The work required steadiness, not ecstasy. When I returned to the central table to update the ledger, I found the captain's handwriting in the margin of the previous night's page. It is a strange intimacy, to recognize a man by the way his letters lose courage at corners. He had amended an entry. Not anomaly, recurrence, assigned to silent watch. Below it, a list of rooftops, like a spell that had forgotten to rhyme. I traced the route with my finger, up the serpent back of Bernini's colonnade, along the lead gray shoulders of saints who have learned to forgive pigeons, past the cupola's narrow service stairs that dream of being ladders, to the spine of the dome where courage slow boils. Inventory complete, I doused the candle and sat in the dark until the dark remembered it held me. I have learned this is an essential step, refused by cowards and hurried past by men who crave applause. To sit in the unlit vault is to hear what one's own pulse hides. In the dark, books become animals mostly small, mostly tired, some ready to bite if the hand is clumsy. Chains become promises you do not intend to keep, but cannot bring yourself to cut. Time takes off its uniform and becomes what it is in its pajamas, nervous, compromised, trying its best. When I lit the candle again, it did not leap, it bloomed. This is a liturgical verb. Flames in these rooms do not misbehave. They are disciplined into opening like flowers that have learned to prefer obedience to sunlight. I carried that bloom along the aisle and stopped at a case I had avoided because it wore its dignity like a weapon. A small chest with a beveled lid, iron straps that looked more like staff lines than shackles, and a keyhole shaped like a question that had swallowed its own tail. The tag read simply, "Ledger Considerations, Moon Stamped." I had opened it before under an older brother's eye, and felt then what I felt now, a reluctance that was not mine. The book did not wish to be touched by hands that could still afford innocence. Mine no longer could, which made me an acceptable clerical hazard. The entries on the left page were decades-old ink dissolved into brown tea, the color of compromise. The right page was newer, with a kind of gloss that suggested someone had written quickly in a room that did not permit pace. Names, dates with small crescents scratched, like private exclamation marks, and columns of trades. 2 hours surrendered from procession route, return to market dawn over Lent. Feast shifted 3 bell strokes, cold spared vines on Aventine. Children's fevers accepted in exchange for unbroken vigil, rectified by mid-June. I wanted to be angry. Anger is an easier sport than comprehension. But the ledger was not wicked. It was administrative mercy practiced at scale, and like all mercies of scale, it cost the wrong people the right amount. At the bottom of the page, a note in the captain's hand, "Night watch to confirm. Beast circling lower. Tethers reinforced at dome ribs 2, 5, 8. No singing above the tonic. The language was routine. The fear behind it was not. The Moon-Beast, to which the Crusaders refused to assign a pronoun, as if grammar would grant it rights, had shifted its path. Lower. Closer to stone. Closer to what humans believe they own. I carried the ledger to the handless clock and held both objects in the same breath. The face fogged, polite as a mirror in an empty room. I imagined the Crusaders arriving after their rooflit negotiation and pressing their palms to this same glass, asking not what time is it, but did the hour keep its promise. This, I realized, was their theology, not that God could be coerced, but that night could be negotiated with. Not miracles minutes moved without scandal. When the first bell of the hour unknotted itself into the vaults, I felt the books lean, the way creatures do when accustomed to a leash that has been shortened by habit. The bell's voice arrived dim and velveted by stone. Bells do not like being underground. They tolerate it when the work is honest. I stood there, ledger open, hand on glass, and for the barest fraction of a surrendered second one of those tithed moments. No clock will miss. I heard another bell answer from nowhere. Not a tone, a hinge turn sound, the shy throat of a latch. Later, I would learn to name it. For now, I only recorded it. Secondary response detected. Metallic, non-local. Duration is less than heartbeat. I did not add the sentence I thought next. The sky practiced opening. The ledger did not exist to indulge poetry. There are practicalities in every haunting. After you write the truth down, you must lock the cabinet, check the chains, blow out the light, and return to a world that does not have a category for what you just experienced. I secured the Viatica cabinet and the sphere's aisle, and the small chest with the ledger that catalogues mercy, as if mercy were a commodity you can stack on a pallet. I pinched the candle and watched the smoke draw a single line upward, like a signature too modest to curve. Then I climbed. The stair that returns to the public level is a test in 3 parts. First, your calves must admit their limits. Second, your ears must recalibrate from whisper to tour group volume. Third, your face must remember the exact arrangement that means I know nothing you would find useful. I passed all 3 with a competence that would have disappointed my mother for being so convincing. On the landing, a brother from the day office crossed my path with an armful of lilies and the expression of a man who believes that flowers can mop. "Inventory?" he asked, the word shaped like a small yawn. "Always," I answered, and we traded nods in the awkward choreography of men who both suspect the other knows more and both hope they are wrong. The sun had not yet hired the sky for the day, so the piazza was a basin of gray promise. The saints on the colonnade practiced their stillness. Pigeons negotiated their morning contracts with the statues they prefer to disrespect. The fountains rehearsed. Water is the opposite of secrecy. It gossips in every direction. I stood there a moment longer than devotion could explain and listened for the hinge sound I had heard below. It did not come. Silence above ground is a different species tamer, but with better lawyers. Back in my cell, I copied my notes from the pocketbook into a more rigorous log, one that would pass inspection if ever requested by a superior with a talent for skepticism. Then, in a second book that pretended to be a prayer journal, I wrote what I could not report. The candle obeyed. The air agreed. The ledger bargains. The beast is lowering its circles. The city will need better chalk. I slept in the late afternoon, the way men do who owe the morning an apology and refuse to give it. My dreams were serviceable. Stairs that could not find their landings, a rosary that clicked before I touched it, a moon that preferred to be counted in breaths rather than numbers. I woke to the small sound that begins most evenings in cities like this, a key turning in a door far away, a sound so ordinary that it wonders why you are making such a fuss. The captain met me that night in the corridor, as if we had agreed to it. He carried a coil of wire and a roll of chalk crescents, and an expression that had been taught not to choose between kindness and efficiency. "Inventory?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Good," he answered, meaning useful, not moral. He handed me the coil. It was lighter than my conscience, and heavier than the forgiveness I had been trained to distribute in 8-minute increments behind a screen. "You will come up," he said, and the verb did not refer to stairs. "I am not one of you," I reminded the air between us. "You're not," he agreed, "but you are already who the roof requires." We moved through the vault as if the shelves had decided we were a story worth making room for. At the Vatican cabinet, he selected a conical vial of selenic grit and tucked it into a pocket with the familiarity of a cook pocketing salt. At the hymn drawer, he chose 2 slips and handed me one. "Hold low A for 8 breaths. Release before the 9th thinks itself a victory." I folded the paper as carefully as you fold a flag. "Why me?" I asked, not because I doubted his pragmatic generosity, but because I wanted a record of his answer. It would matter later, when the city asked for a story it could live with. "Because you heard the candle," he said, "and you wrote it down without asking it to make you important." See, if there is a virtue I still recognize in myself, it is this: I prefer to be necessary to being known. The vault trains this into us, chisels it where vanity once kept a pet bed. To carry chalk without needing to be seen drawing, to sing the note without signing the hymn, to stand where a latch might choose to practice opening and keep your throat calm. We passed the handless clock. He touched the glass with a palm that had learned the difference between request and order. The fog bloomed, then cleared like a shy thought. "We'll be back," he said, "to the room, to the ledger, to the agreement that had been taught to forgive seconds in exchange for a city that could survive its mornings." Above us, the stairs remembered their job. The door at the top admitted us to the skin of the basilica, the narrow, wind-polished paths that seamed together cupola and colonnades, and the shoulders of saints who, up close, look less like marble and more like the idea of fatigue made obedient. Rome spread below in proofs and footnotes, alleys that correct each other, domes that plagiarize, fountains that annotate sunlight. The night had put on its usual patience. He showed me the first tether point, a chalk crescent that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to see discipline as a drawing. He ran the coil's wire through its lip and fastened it to a small iron cleat. Someone had convinced the architect to pretend was decorative. "When we tell the night to pause," he said, "we do it with respect. Not because we believe it deserves it, but because we prefer surviving to winning." "Winning?" I asked. "Theology's favorite bad habit," he said. "Win an argument with the sky, and it will remember. It will win the next 10 in a row while you're busy celebrating." We laid 3 tethers along a route that traced the dome's slow exhale, then crossed to the colonnade, where the saints' silhouettes kept company with a modest wind. The city watched us without admitting it. From one balcony, a woman smoking looked up and decided we were an optical lesson. From a small square, a cat lifted its head and performed an old ritual of indifference. This is the solace of rooftops. The world below continues to believe in its own sufficient narrative. By the time we reached the last crescent, the moon had cleared the frown of a cloud and taken on that thin, surgical brightness that renders stone honest. He handed me the hymn slip. "Not yet," he said, "but soon." "What will I be singing to?" I asked. "Not to," he corrected. "With. We never sing at. That is how you break glass." The wind softened. The city, with the manners of a patient being prepped, let its noises dim to a steady hum. Far below, a clock began its pre-bell sigh. The captain closed his eyes, not in prayer, in calibration, and nodded. The wire in my hand hummed like an animal remembering its species. I placed the hymn slip between teeth and lip, the way old men hold nails when they are building something they cannot name. I inhaled the way a diver does. I sang. Low A has a way of convincing your bones they are instruments. It is not beautiful, it is useful. The note opens your ribs like a door you intend to leave on the latch. The first breath was clumsy. I am not a choir boy. But the second found a place to live. On the third, the closest lamp along the colonnade dipped its light, not as in failure, but as in etiquette. On the fourth, the wire in my hand tightened, and I felt not a tug, not pressure attention. Attention is a weight. It pressed along the tether like a hand testing a banister. "Release," the captain said, and I did, before the ninth breath could discover pride. Pride is the vowel that breaks treaties. The night resumed its usual arithmetic. He nodded as if I had signed a form adequately. "You'll do," he said, with the generosity peculiar to men who have regretted their certainty before. We moved back toward the cupola, and he spoke without looking at me, the way one talks to someone you are teaching to drive. What you felt was not a creature in the way that the public imagines. We use beast because metaphor is easier to dress. Think instead of a tide that grew a preference. It circles because circles are how patience advertises. It leans lower when sequence is weak. When too many feasts have been moved. When too many stories have been trimmed for comfort. When the city's memory runs a fever. We tether it so the morning can assemble its face. "And if we fail?" I asked. "We don't," he said simply, then ruined the bravado with honesty. "We haven't. Yet. There is Spirian. They're amended. Go with through." Back in the vault, after the roof had practiced survival with us one more night, I closed the inventory with a sentence that would look, to anyone who did not know better, like ceremony, all present, all bound, all remembered. Then I added, in the only place a man is permitted to be fully human, his private log, what the ledger does not ask for, and the institution cannot swallow. The candle chose, the air consented, the wire listened. I sang to the hinge of the sky, and it considered opening. We apologized to nothing. We asked only for permission to continue. No one will award me for these sentences. That is the point. The work does not love medals. It loves competence. It loves the kind of attention that refuses to become a headline. It loves the exact middle distance between cowardice and theater. If I sound calm, it is because calm is cheaper than panic and more efficient than hope. But hear this plainly. The vault taught me that knowledge is not neutral. We chained books not to keep thieves out, but to keep memory from leaving. We corrected calendars not to be right, but to be survivable. And we walked the roofs with chalk and wire and unjoyful hymns, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a city is to ask the night to sit still long enough for children to wake without bruises shaped like ours that never happened. This is the story I promised you. Not miracles, not monsters with appetites measurable in virgins, not drama designed to nourish the gossip glands. A candle that slides, a ledger that bargains, a wire that hums when attention arrives, a note held just long enough to be believed by stone. These are the tools by which an institution edits reality into something a morning can represent to itself, without needing to lie more than is polite. And somewhere above us, or inside us, or threaded through both, like hair through a brush, the moon's patient orbit rehearses the same old lesson. Circles comfort, circles corral, circles conceal. Our job is not to break the circle. It is to keep it from tightening around the throat of the hours. If you're still with me, breathe once, for the seconds we have all forgiven without knowing their names. The candle is steady, the shelves are listening, the door behind us is closed, not because we are afraid, but because the corridor prefers a boundary. We will open it again. We always do. The night watch is not a shift, it is a practice. And practice, as the books tell me when they forget to be humble, is how even stone learns a new hymn. The first time I was ordered to correct a feast, I thought they meant liturgy music, vestments, the careful positioning of a reliquary whose window had developed a discouraging smudge. In these buildings, correction is a synonym whose meanings multiply like shadows at dusk. The instruction came in a folded note tucked into the ledger of considerations, written in the captain's hand, which had the tempo of someone who has negotiated with cliff edges. The line was sparse enough to pass as housekeeping. Advance the vigil by 3 bell strokes. Reconcile by dawn. Below it, a small crescent scratched into the date as if the month itself needed a witness. I carried the note to the handless clock because it had become my reflex, the way some men carry worries to a window and others to a bottle. The glass exhaled against my palm, as if my presence gave it permission to be visible. I learned to read that breath, the way surgeons read monitors. It did not tell me the hour. It told me whether the hour had agreed to behave. To understand what came next, you must accept a premise that schools politely refuse to teach. Calendars are not facts, they are treaties. The Julian gave way to the Gregorian the way a general gives way to a gardener after a century of weeds. Officially, the reform was arithmetic, leap days and drift, equinox and obedience. Unofficially, it was choreography of the populace, when to fast and when to sell fish, when to attend mass and when to marry, when to reckon debts and when to claim absolution by date rather than by deed. Change the days, and you relocate grief. You displace joy. You edit the anniversaries by which a city remembers itself. We kept 2 texts on the table that night. The public ordo, with its dignified schedule of solemnities, and a thin, unmarked book whose margins carried the impatient script of the silent watch. The first told the world what it would be permitted to call today. The second tracked the costs of making that permission survivable. Advance the vigil by 3 bell strokes, the captain repeated, and his tone suggested an old domestic habit like drawing the curtains early so the cat doesn't prowl. The beast is circling lower. The city will ask for morning before the night has finished its work. How do you advance a vigil without advancing time? I asked. You don't, he said. You forgive seconds. He showed me the calculus that is not taught in universities because it is practiced in basements. Shave a breath here, a pause there. Ask the choir to hold one vowel shorter than habit. Coax a procession to move at a pace that whispers hurry to no one and obey to stone. We marked the program in pencil. Pencil is the theology of regret. We rehearsed the ushers in a corridor that had learned not to judge. They took the corners tighter. They learned to make reverence efficient. We asked a sacristan who loved perfection more than people to ring the bell as if discretion had a pitch. 3 strokes came early. The city did not notice, but the pigeons rose as if the air had made a decision without consulting them. Down in the vault, the handless clock fogged once one's soft consent. Above, I felt the wire we had laid along the dome hum in a key somewhere between metal and mammal. The vigil advanced. Dawn took the hint. By morning, the registers reported nothing at all. That is what success looks like, when your profession is keeping reality exactly as boring as it claims to be. This is how I met phantom time, not as a theory, but as a tool. In books, the hypothesis behaves like a boar, all tusk and swagger, centuries invented to flatter rulers, to disguise incompetence, to seat popes before they were born. In practice, phantom time is meeker and more dangerous. It is seconds that never join a minute, breaths that never add up to an hour, nights that yield their proof to dawn without filing paperwork. We didn't create centuries. We starved some intervals and overfed others until the civic memory kept waking up slightly underweight and the baker shrugged and cut the loaves thinner. In a blue-lined folio, brittle as an old commandment, I found the minutes of a conclave that never reached the public record. The parchment listed 2 names for a single stretch of months, written in different inks that disagreed politely about authority. In column A, a pontiff whose portrait still stares down schoolchildren in textbooks, hand raised in a blessing that has learned to be wallpaper. In column B, a caretaker whose seal appears nowhere else, whose decrees were administrative kindnesses aimed at keeping a bridge from collapsing and a famine from admitting its intentions too loudly. Duplications, the marginal note called them, an arrangement for months when the sky refused to keep only one appointment at a time. False popes? I asked, because dramatic nouns help cowards like me feel we're doing something dangerous by merely pronouncing them. Private ones, the captain corrected. When the hours split, you assign one man to the version you can advertise and another to the one that requires wire and chalk. Both are real, but only one can survive noon. We stood at the handless clock and read the entries like surgeons reviewing anesthesia logs. Bells rung but unheard. Children on a certain street dreaming the same door. 3 nights missing from registers. Cold spared vines. Debt paid in silence. This was our pharmacology. Dose the city with obedience and retrieve it before anyone noticed the taste. Too much, and you get miracles, which breed prosecutions. Too little, and the moon writes the program herself. Opposite the ledger, a map lay under glass, a palimpsest of Rome that had undergone more erasures than a guilty diary. I warmed the parchment with breath, the way a locksmith warms a stubborn key. Streets rose from underneath like bones surfacing, then hints of older lines that curved where the modern city insists on angles. Then, faint as a bruise, a ghost river, veining the underbelly of neighborhoods that pretend to be dry. Beside the river, a sequence of crescents, our tethers, was penciled in an older hand. Hold here, persuade there, never sing at this corner, or the lamps will remember they were once stars. We possessed a theology of lamps. The public knows them as utilities, and utilities have the good manners of not asking to be saints. But we'd learn to read their flickers as responses: assent, refusal, ambivalence. The small sulk that means you held the note a breath too long. A route through the colonnade could be scored like a motet. Every fifth lamp was the tonic. Between them, suspensions that held the beast curious without making it hungry. As for saints, the ledger kept a separate list, the inventory of names edited for public safety. Some were demoted from calendars because their legends had grown teeth sharp enough to cut policy. Others, because their stories were too effective at making people brave in the wrong directions. One entry stayed with me because it was written in a hand that trembled even as it obeyed. Name removed. Feast absorbed into nearest more obedient story. Relic relabeled as regional. Prayers redirected to a safer mouth. I held the page and felt the shame of a mortician who has been praised for making a difficult corpse presentable. The question becomes, as it always does, who profits? In one of the chain-bound volumes De Memoriam Publicum, on public memory, a long-dead scribe offered a sentence my teachers would have called cynical, and my vocation called useful. He who can assign today can rent yesterday and evict tomorrow. Assign enough feasts, and markets follow. Shift enough vigils, and riots arrive or fail to. Rename enough saints, and courage migrates like birds whose maps we can quietly alter with well-timed bells. Not all edits were benign. In the locked drawer beneath the ledger, I found a packet of abjurations, formal apologies the watch had offered when a correction cut the wrong nerve. They were addressed to families rather than to God. We advanced hours that were not ours to move. Your child's fever was an interest payment. We have forgiven the rest. Accept this food. Accept this visit. Accept our promise to keep better accounts. Some were refused. Refusal is the last sacrament of the poor. It was during this season of corrections that the clock refused to strike, the public one, the one that disciplines the piazza. At the appointed moment, the bell roused its chest and simply decided against participating. The square held its breath the way crowds do when a long-trusted performer forgets the first line. The pigeons looked personally offended. A tourist raised her phone at the silence, as if the device could bully time into being interesting. Up on the roof, we felt the wire tremble with suppressed appetite. Not a failure, the captain said. A negotiation tactic. He requested a hymn, and we obliged, pressing our ribs into the shape of a low A that could be mistaken, by a forgiving ear, for patience. We laid chalk crescents like commas, and did not step on them. One must not stamp on punctuation, or it will learn to end sentences out of spite. The handless clock in the vault fogged. The public clock reconsidered its mood. The bell found its voice on the next stroke, and the crowd laughed, because relief is showy. That laugh the ledger would later note it as acceptable leakage paid for 3 seconds of disobedience elsewhere. Our worst night came with ordinary weather. The beast, that tied with opinions, brought its orbit down low enough to comb the dome with a thought. The wire raised gooseflesh against my palm. The lamps along the colonnade blinked in a pattern that approximated "you forgot a step." We had. 2 feasts had been translated in the same week to spare a harvest and to hide an execution that had needed the dignity of fog. The city's sequence was threadbare. The beast leaned. Then the handless clock pulsed once a soft herald, and we began the slow art of giving seconds back. We reversed small graces we had taken for granted, gave the choir longer breaths, returned a pause to the gospel, allowed a procession to drift the width of a doorway, let a mother cry the extra minute she had earned. These are exchanges you cannot announce from a balcony, but they matter. The beast rose, not offended, merely full. I understood then the captain's least dramatic axiom: we do not defeat, we feed until it is courteous. In the course of these edits, I became intimate with the secret archives that the public believes exist in the same way they believe in dragons. Comfortably. There is no single vault labeled the truth. There are rooms allergic to sunlight and others allergic to gossip. There are stacks dedicated to periods of civic insomnia and stacks dedicated to the choreographies of plague. There are drawers of maps that decline to be counted by the census because they answer to rivers and to winds rather than to ministries. We are taught to call it all stewardship. When I wrote privately, I called it editing the weather of memory. And yes, because you will ask. Because the thriller in you prefers blood in the carpet to the arithmetic of bells, there were documents that attempted to arrange scripture the way a man arranges his desk before a guest arrives. Edges aligned. Difficult chapters moved to shelves, labeled supplements for catechists. I refused that work. Others did not. One night, a brother whose ambition had chafed his vows until they squeaked, placed in my hands a draft in which Thomas and Mary were excused from the room so that a more useful story could get a word in. I returned it to him without notes. We are gardeners, I said, not inventors of fruit. He looked at me as if I had claimed to be a cloud. A gardener prunes, he answered, and sometimes he grafts. It is difficult to argue with a metaphor once it has learned violence. What I learned in those months will read, to those who prefer headlines, like cowardice. We did not expose, we adjusted. But that is what kept children from waking in alleys with hours-shaped bruises. It is what kept markets from fever when feasts migrated at short notice. It is what allowed funerals to proceed at a pace that convinced the living to remain so. We paid with seconds. We printed receipts in a ledger that can be opened in the presence of the handless clock and no other. We lied only by omission, which is to say, we lied the way weather lies, by showing you only the sky you can use. If the moral ledger galls you as it galled me, know this. Repentance in our profession is a to-do list. I logged what could be returned. I wrote, in the margin of a night most men slept through, restore the 3 strokes we stole from a widow's vigil. Return the extra minute to a nurse on the 5th ward. Give back the hymn's-held vowel to the choir boy whose breath stuttered when the beast leaned. These are not grand gestures. They are corrections in pencil, later inked if the stone consents. We kept quiet in the daytime not because the truth was shameful, but because the explanations would be. Explain to a baker that you moved the dawn because the moon drifted lower, and he will call the police. If you are lucky, the police will be tired. Explain to a teacher that you reassigned a saint because courage had begun to pool in a neighborhood where courage is a fire hazard, and she will either bless you or spit. In the ledger, we called such public conversations unprofitable liturgies. We avoided them the way you avoid a stair with loose nails, carefully and with a promise to fix it after dark. By the end of the season, the city had resumed pretending to be one continuous surface rather than a mosaic of negotiated fragments. That is the gift and the danger of Rome. It is beautiful at scale. A dome persuades you to forgive a dozen wounds you would notice if you could afford to carry a microscope up the stairs. The captain and I stood on the roof one dawn when the piazza had not yet remembered its appetite for spectacle. He handed me a small piece of chalk, the ordinary kind that resurrects boards and keeps teachers alive. "You'll keep it," he said. "It is the smallest tool we own, and the only one that doesn't lie. With it you will draw crescents where the night agrees to pause. With it you will erase what you can't afford to understand. And with what remains, you will teach the hours their manners. That's so very too well, and to tarry it with half. Is that our job?" I asked. "No," he said. "Our job is to love Rome enough to insist that mornings are possible." We walked the spine of the dome in silence, and when the first bell struck a little early by our request and the city's need, the sound bounded off stone as if the air had been paid in advance. I pressed my hand to the handless clock later and felt it fog with a steadiness I had come to recognize as grace. Not the kind sung about in choirs, the kind that admits invoices and pays them on time. Down in the vault, the ledger of considerations waited, unscandalized by our victories, uninterested in poetry. I wrote with the stamina of a clerk who has been cured of drama. Vigil advanced by 3 strokes, reconciled by dawn. No public anomalies observed. Lamps polite, wire agreeable, choir unjoyful, which is correct. Then, in the book that pretended to be my prayer journal, I allowed myself one forbidden line: "Time is obedient to the hand that dares hold it gently. The beast circles lower when we grow proud. Humility is the rope, confession the knot." The chapter of calendars had not closed. It rarely does, but the hours had agreed, for a while, to stand where the chalk told them to, and the moon had accepted, for a circuit or two, the dignity of being tethered. The city woke on schedule and forgave us our arithmetic by doing what cities do when they are given the gift of not noticing. It bought bread, it lit candles, it fell in love, it forgot. It is tempting to call that forgetfulness a sin. It is not. It is the price of keeping faith with a morning that does not need to spend its first hour explaining why it exists. A map is a story that has bribed geometry to pretend it's the truth. I learned this the first time I warmed a sheet of parchment with my breath and watched streets resurrect like old grievances. Lines came up in layers. A current Rome, assertive and well-groomed. Beneath it, a Rome that had learned humility from fires. Under that, a Rome that distrusted straight edges and loved rivers more than kings. Cartography is not a record. It's a negotiation between what stones remember and what officials can sell. The Vatican cabinet had trained me in tools chalk that refuses to squeal, crescents that prefer to carve stone rather than skin, wire that hums when attention leans. But the deeper drawer in that cabinet held the discipline that separates watchers from wanderers, the art of erasure. The packet was simple 3 brushes, a shallow bowl, a stoppered vial labeled vinum tepidum in a hand with too much patience, and a sheet of instructions copied so many times the script had become a rumor of itself. "Warm the wine," it began, "until it remembers it was sun. Wet the brush until it is obedient but not servile. Apply to the page that claims to be finished. Wait for what it regrets." I did as told. In the cartography room, a long, low nave of tables whose lamps were trained to behave like patient moons, I unrolled a map that had been certified accurate by 3 ministries, and a parish priest who loved accuracy the way some men love dogs. Rome sprawled across the paper in the confident scrawl of the living. Streets, squares, fountains, administrative borders, the body language of a city that knows how to perform for postcards. I warmed the wine and painted the thinnest veil across the Trastevere, the Aventine, the ribcage of streets near the river where children learn to trust their feet before they trust their histories. At first, nothing. Then, like a bruise admitting it has a story, a faint line rose from underneath, parallel to the visible Tiber, and then coyly disobedient to it, slipping under a convent, surfacing behind a brick altar, crossing a courtyard no tourist would spend a photo on. The Ghost River. I had heard of it in notes written by men who never married, because loyalty prefers shelves. Seeing it was like realizing your house has been politely sharing its meals with something you never invited but would feel guilty asking to leave. Under the Ghost River came symbols I had learned to recognize by shape rather than by faith. Little crescents tucked into rooflines, the mark of tether points, tiny hatchings along balustrades, the safe places for wire to listen, and, faintly, an emblem that made my throat behave as if it had encountered a new temperature. A circle with 3 short lines radiating inward, as if a halo had been designed by an engineer. In the margin, written in a hand that refused flourish, 3 words, Angelus Cartographus approved. The cartographer angel is not doctrine. He does not appear in the statues. No stained glass has been commissioned in his honor. No child has been named for him in the last 100 years without an argument in a kitchen. But in the back pages of ledgers where the watch keeps its arithmetic honest, there are approvals stamped with his sign, maps that would not keep their lies steady unless a witness older than bureaucracies agreed to hold them still. I learned to recognize his authority the way one recognizes one's heartbeat in a crowd by the absence of panic. Do you pray to him? I asked the captain once, when we stood over a table where 5 maps argued without words. We invoice him, he said. He signs off. That's a kind of prayer the stone understands. The art of erasure demanded practice, and practice demanded sacrilege, the safe kind, the kind that offends only paper. I worked on disposable copies first, the sort made to impress committees. Warm wine to wake the sun inside it, brush to persuade the top layer to confess, patience to let regret rise. Street names slid aside to reveal older names scratched at angles like bones that had healed wrong. Arrows softened and curved. In the margins, longer notes appeared in tiny script, the secret orders that kept the city from despising its own appetite for continuity. Some orders wore public names: Society of Jesus, Order of Friars Minor, the canons regular who run like invisible plumbing under civic rituals. Others wore names used only at night, chess pieces for a board whose squares were mornings. Collegium Umbrae, Confraternity of Quiet Repairs, Archivists ad interim. Titles are masks that tell you what a man wants to be forgiven for. These names forgave themselves their usefulness. Their directives were never dramatic. Move procession to avoid confluence of feasts and fever. Clip sermon by 2 minutes. Restore those seconds to the cathedral clock by vespers. Do not sing above tonic in the south aisle on nights when the lamps practice memory. Occasionally, a bolder line. Reassign saint legend, provoking unlicensed courage in quarter already too flammable. I held those maps as if they were infants whom the world would misunderstand and hurt for it. In a locked flat file labeled palimpsests, I found the documents that have since become my private religion. Many had been scraped with razors so fine they could shave a lie without cutting fact. Their surfaces looked cleaned, even hopeful. But brush the warmed wine, and the erased hands rise, exhausted but insisting. On one, a pilgrim route emerged that did not touch any of the official stations, terminating instead in a cloister garden, whose door opens only for those who have learned to knock with 2 silences and 1 question. On another, a sequence of circles stamped along rooftops, rooftop gates no bigger than a palm, each circle paired with a notation in the Halo language so brief it felt like a mercy. If the watch needed to lure the Moon-Beast into a courteous ellipse, they would open 2 of those gates and suggest a path between them, as if setting out saucers of milk for a tide with habits. The angel's stamp appeared on these 2, small and without vanity. The first time I traced it, it felt warm not in the way gold is warm to the eye, but the way a hand is warm to the absent. I asked the captain whether the angel could be summoned. "You don't summon someone who was here before doors," he said. "You place the chalk with respect. You hold the note without joy. And if you've done the arithmetic right, something older than your profession agrees not to embarrass you. If erasure is the art of removing a thing without advertising the theft, there is a parallel art I came to trust only after it terrified me: reinscription. Not adding, returning. The vault had a small table devoted to it, the sanding altar bearing papers so thin they could be mistaken for shyness. We would lay the injured map over the altar, and with a cloth the size of a folded handkerchief, rub the surface in small circles until a faint shine came up. Then, with a needle no longer than a thumbnail, we pricked the places where the city had promised once to be itself. This was not restoration. We were not museum men draped in white coats performing guilt. It was tune-making, tightening strings. You could hear the page settle when the tension was right, a small adjustment like the sound a choir makes when a conductor lifts one finger in apology and the pitch slides into consent. The secret orders did not always consent to one another. The Jesuit who ran the school near the river believed in education the way sailors believe in weather useful until it kills you. He favored maps that taught children to recognize the shape of trouble and then demand saintly intervention. The archivist ad interim assigned to the same quarter believed in competence, tethers and hymns, and the dignity of correct rope. Their marginal notes argued in decorous Latin, each clause grim with patience. The angel's stamp favored neither. It simply appeared on maps that had learned to sing at the pitchstone keeps for emergencies. We maintained a drawer for forgeries, public maps engineered to conceal repairs. You could spot them by their enthusiasm. Real maps are humble. Forged ones perform for donors. Jewel-toned waters, streets drawn sharper than honesty, saints parading in borders. We kept them for one reason. The beast likes glitter. On nights when we needed to persuade it not to comb the dome with thought, we would unroll a forgery on the roof and pin it under small stones, a lure of false geometry that convinced appetite to perform its circles elsewhere. Bait for a tide is still bait. In the back of the drawer, I found a map without borders. It looked like rain had done its version of calligraphy arcs, stains, the delicate branching that occurs when water eats paper the way guilt eats sleep. But under warmed wine a line rose, stubborn and exact. A street that never existed on any civic record, running from the bronze doors of the basilica to a narrow alcove where no door stands now. The notation read, Procession of the absent Pope. One night only. Lamps abstained. I thought of the duplications ledger, 2 columns of pontiffs for months, when the sky refused singularity. This map recorded one of those nights when the private pope walked the invisible street to bless a city he could not legally rule and to forgive a dawn the public would not have survived. I pressed my palm to the page, and the room cooled as if shade had been revealed where none had been drawn. The discipline of nowhere is rigorous. Maps to nowhere, the captain called them, because the routes they traced were not permitted to appear in any book a tourist could purchase or a judge could cite. Their stations were roofs, shadows, chalk crescents that vanished with the first unambitious rain. Their pilgrims were men in heavy cloaks who refused drama and owned shoes that knew the weight of wire. The first night I walked a nowhere map beside the captain. The wind laid a hand on my head like a blessing that had learned to keep its voice down. We moved from crescent to crescent, wire paying out with the discretion of a confession. Hymn slip stuck to the back of my teeth like a taste I was not prepared to confirm. At the third station, a balustrade politely denying its fear of gravity, the captain pressed his fingers to the stone and then to his throat. "Do you hear it?" he asked. At first, only wind, the large indifference. Then, under it, a pattern like fabric being folded by a careful old woman. Not movement. Rearrangement. "The city is tensing," he said. "Something will try to right itself where it doesn't belong. We will erase it before it becomes proud." We sang not art, not ecstasy, not even the church's idea of beauty, utility. A low A that asked 1,000 bricks to agree on a breath. Lamps along the colonnade dipped, then held, as if they were citizens at a balcony being asked for patience. Wire hummed in my palm. The chalk crescents, invisible to anyone without the habit of looking, did their humble work. Brackets around a sentence that was not allowed to run on. The nowhere route connected our efforts the way a scar connects mistakes. The beast circled lower, curious as hunger. Then, in a movement that felt more like relief than victory, rose to a more polite orbit. "Good," the captain said. "To the air, to me, to the angel, to the ledger, downstairs, that would categorize this as normal operation. Maps are also weapons, and we kept a safe for the ones that could cut indiscriminately. One showed a Rome in which every erased saint reappeared at once, each insisting on his feast. It looked beautiful, the way weeds look beautiful to those who do not own a garden. Another showed the city with the ghost river fattened to arrogance, reclaiming streets that had mocked it. A third mapped only absence, alleys where curiosity had been declined for generations, rooms that had learned to behave like closets even when they had windows, the slow creep of educations that trained children to apologize for noticing. We used these sparingly. The watch is not immune to theater, but it is allergic to spectacle that costs the wrong people. In a small envelope within the angel's drawer, I found a note in a hand so steady it frightened me. The first map is the body. The second is the breath. The third is the story others tell about the first two. Use the third to correct the second and spare the first. For years, I used that sentence to quiet men who loved heroism more than mornings. It never failed. Men who crave applause grow shy when asked to carry air. The secret orders had their own maps, and we were permitted to audit them when the beast's orbit descended. The Jesuits kept a curriculum map so detailed it could have grieved a librarian into retirement concepts, arranged like organs. Each lesson a valve. The quiet repairs kept a cemetery of corridors, passages bricked up to prevent certain echo behaviors. The archivists ad interim kept minutes of pauses, a ledger of silences scheduled into sermons so that people could think one thought too long and discover whether it was dangerous. Over all of them, the angel's stamp appeared like a notary who hated court but loved correctness. I asked the captain once whether the angel had a name we could say without risking theology. He had one once, the captain said. He mispronounced it on purpose and liked the result. He hasn't used either since. And where does he keep his maps? I asked. In the city, the captain answered, as if I had asked where the sky keeps its weather. In the habits of stone, in the angles that never learn to lie, in the routes cats prefer, in the places where pigeons practice democracy. Angelic maps don't live on paper. They rent paper when humans need to be convinced. The longer I worked in the cartography room, the more I resented tidy nouns. Nothing stays a thing here. A river is a habit. A street is a rumor with cobblestones. A church is a negotiation between acoustics and guilt. A map is a treaty signed by paper and broken by weather. Erasure is not amnesia. It is the courtesy of removing a detail that the day cannot afford. Reinscription is not nostalgia. It is the act of telling the future what it once promised to be and asking whether it still intends to try. On a damp night that smelled of stone teaching rain how to behave indoors, we received a panic map, a courier's bundle wrapped in greasy paper, handed off to the watch with the kind of look men give when they need to be forgiven before they know what for. It was a current civic plan of the quarter near the river, streets too confident, lamps placed where lamps prefer not to be. I warmed the wine. Under the bright certainty rose old lines, the ghost river fat with rain, a procession route that would cross it at the worst possible moment, and chalk crescents that someone had scrupulously erased with clean violence. Under the crescents the angel's stamp, faint and stubborn, approved. Then erased. The bureaus had overwritten the watch. "Show me the program," the captain said, already tired. A vigil had been scheduled too long, a sermon too clever by half, a saint too brave, assigned to a neighborhood where bravery catches like dry laundry. We could not move the feast without admitting error. Pride is a civic resource. It is rationed like bread. So we did what we do. We corrected what could be corrected under the skin. We shortened vowels. We returned seconds. We redrew a quiet angle on a balcony so that a crowd would drift rather than compress. On the roof, we traced an emergency nowhere map, a rescue ellipse, and the wire paid out like a leash for a dog that refuses to learn its name. The beast noticed the erasures it had been promised and came to inspect the work. We held our note. The lamps looked away out of courtesy. The angel did not arrive in any way a child would recognize, which is to say, he arrived perfectly. By dawn, the panic map was just a map again. The quarter woke without remembering what it had almost become. I filed the forged version into the safe, labeled tidy enough to survive audits. Reference public edition. The corrected palimpsest went under glass with other maps that had learned to be boring. The ledger labeled the night, resolved by sequence. The handless clock exhaled against my palm, with a tempered fog neither alarm nor praise. These are the respirations of a city that has learned to survive its administrators. There remains one map I have not described, though the lure to dramatize it is strong. It lies folded in a private drawer beneath the angel's stamp. half its surface torn by a hand that regretted even as it ripped. It shows the night Rome stopped time, not the event itself that belongs to the next chapter of confession, but the roots prepared to make the impossible survivable. 2 gates on the dome, 3 crescents laid along balustrades that most men never learn to trust, a sequence of lamp flickers that spell hold in a language no utility company would agree to know. In the margin, the angel's only long sentence I have ever found. If you must arrest a river, offer it 3 escapes. If you must pause a city, leave it 2 breaths. If you must hold the moon, remember your hands are mortal and behave. We have learned to behave. Not perfectly, not in ways that will win us statues or songs, not in ways that satisfy the part of me that still wants to expose rather than repair. The cartography room taught me restraint sharper than any blade. It taught me that nowhere is not an absence. It is a corridor reserved for hours that cannot survive daylight. It taught me that erasure can be an act of love when the alternative is spectacle. It taught me to trust a stamp left by a being who has no reason to flatter paper or men. If you are still with me, moisten a finger with your own breath and trace the air in front of you in a small crescent. That gesture belongs to no church, offends no court, and reassures stone in ways sermons rarely can. We will need crescents where we are going next. The map is already laid out on the roof. The wire is coiled like a promise. The lamps have been informed that their patience will be requested beyond habit. The beast is lowering its circle. The city is tensing. The clock with no hands is preparing its one pulse. The angel has left his stamp where only paper can see it. And we, poor editors of a manuscript that insists on being alive, are about to write a sentence that no morning should ever have to read aloud. You would expect the world to announce itself before it violates its own rules. Thunder warning of a storm, sirens warning of a fire. But the night Rome stopped. Time began with a sound so modest that it could have been a glove set on a table. The wire on the dome, our quiet leash for an appetite that preferred circles, trembled as if a distant thought had decided to become local. We had rehearsed the map for weeks, the nowhere route traced in chalk crescents that rain had learned to respect. 2 gates set on the dome's ribs, 3 more along the colonnade. A discreet counsel delivered to lamps that liked to pretend they served only electricians. The choir had been instructed in a discipline that forbids joy, their breath measured in poverty rather than abundance. The handless clock downstairs had received our palms and given back the usual fog, polite, unsurprised, the respiratory rate of institutions. But preparation is a story we tell to make accidents feel adopted. When the beast lowered its orbit, it did not roar. It leaned. The city adjusted its weight as a patient does when the surgeon says, "You'll feel pressure." The river paused its rehearsal of being a mirror. Pigeons gathered in a circle on the edge of the piazza, the way jurors sometimes do when they have decided guilt is less interesting than mercy. The first bell considered its schedule and shrugged. "Positions," the captain said, and the word passed along rooftops like a careful rumor. I took the second tether station on the dome's southern shoulder, where the wind arrived with the tone of a tutor corrective, not cruel. The chalk crescent at my feet looked like an apology made by someone who meant it. I threaded the wire through the notch and felt the first pull, a polite suggestion from something that had learned our names and preferred not to use them. Across the curve of the cupola, I saw 2 other watchmen anchoring their crescents, with hands that had forgotten vanity. One nodded to me, without looking. On the colonnade, 3 more figures placed their palms flat to stone, as if persuading a large animal to accept a harness it had worn since before churches had learned to count. Beneath us, the city listened. Kitchens cooled to a patient glow. A woman paused with a cup of water half lifted. A man at a window chose not to clear his throat. The saints around the square practiced stillness with professional pride. The only movement that dared to announce itself was a thin wash of air sliding along the marble, sending back the clean medicinal scent of stone on its best behavior. I held the hymn slip between cheek and gum, like a carpenter's nail. Hold low A for the length of grief at a kitchen table. Release before pride. The captain raised a hand, 2 fingers extended, and I watched the moon answer by removing 1 layer of distance. It is hard to explain what that looks like without inventing a physics the church would not enjoy. Imagine a lid taken off a pot you did not know was covered. Imagine the sky admitting it has hinges. We began to sing. The first breath was a negotiation with my own ribs. Low A is not the note of glory. It is the note of work. You do not sing it to be admired. You sing it because someone must carry the weight that verbs cannot. The wire tightened not like a noose, not like a snare, but like the steady belt of a patient, the nurse assures, will make the procedure survivable. Lamps along the south colonnade dipped their heads in arc-minute bows, assent without servility. The chalk under my boot hummed so faintly, I only heard it because I had learned to recognize when stone corrects its posture. Somewhere above the dome, the air rearranged itself to resemble agreement. By the 4th breath, the piazza had stilled into a portrait. Fountains held their silver diagrams half-finished. A stray dog discovered that its bark made no sound and decided not to indulge existential crises. The public clock on the far wall hesitated, a sovereign confronted with a petition from physics. In the vault beneath us, the handless clock fogged. I did not see it. I felt it, the way a man knows a loved one has entered a room by the temperature around his name. The beast drew lower, its presence reading like weight to the hands and like shyness to the eyes. It did not want to be seen. It wanted us to know it could be courteous or not, and that courtesy would cost. Anchor, the captain breathed, and our rosaries answered with their discreet clicks. Beads turned, tiny gears accepted grief in measured teeth. The wire became a sentence lengthened by clauses we could not afford to cut. Across the roof's curve, I caught a glimpse of the captain's profile. Not heroic, not holy, only correct. The face of a man who has apologized to everything he loves and carries on because someone must teach mourning its manners. Release, he signaled, and we let the note go, as if setting a slow bird back into a sky which pretends not to notice kindnesses. The beast did not rise. It settled. The city lowered. An elevator misreading instructions and stopping between floors. The air became dense with fairness. I could see a child in a window across the square holding a toy with both hands, eyes round, the international expression for "I am permitted to witness." A man on a bicycle moved half a meter and then remembered he was an illustration. The river inhaled and forgot to exhale. Again, the captain said, and we obeyed, not because we believed obedience is holy, but because coordination is. The second sequence was not a repetition. Repetition is a lie you tell to reduce cost. This was maintenance, We laid the tone like plaster over a crack the public cannot afford to notice. The chalk crescents brightened a shade invisible to anyone who does not love roofs. Lamps regained their composure and then offered it to us like a cousin bringing wine unasked. The wire found its voice. A mild tremolo, the sound of attention leaning. Then, the clock refused to strike. It had not forgotten. It declined. I watched its great hand, precisely at the mark demanded by office and tradition, pause in the poise of a bird trained to alight and given a better instruction. Silence is rarely so articulate. The square felt it, pigeons performing small, offended shuffles. The dog lying down with the theater of a civil servant whose task has been cancelled. A tourist raising a phone and recording a film of the city doing nothing very well. We were very quietly out of time. "Hold," the captain ordered, and we did, the low. A stretched like canvas, each of us hiding our personal panic in vowels. My breath searched for the wall it had been promised. It found instead a soft, resistant fabric, the kind tent makers apprentice on for years before the master lets them near a storm's sails. The beast pressed, not hard, not greedy, only present. A tide with a preference, a moon with an argument. "Gate," he said, and the northern watcher stepped to the first hinge we had prepared along the rib. He pressed 2 fingers to the stone and whispered the halo language, that brief, subhuman protocol that convinces angels to remember they are not above being helpful. A seam in the air remembered itself. You could see it as a crease moving along a giant invisible curtain. No special effects, just the city admitting it could be persuaded to keep its secrets in order. "Second gate," the captain said, and to the east another seam recognized its cue and lifted its small, private latch. Between them, a corridor formed the rescue ellipse we had drawn 12 times on paper and never wished to use. It did not glow. It did not thunder. It existed. You could feel the relief rising from the old bricks, like the smell after rain begins, that sigh which is the city's way of saying, "This will not end badly if you behave." We held the note, then set it down. The wire slackened to the precise tension requested by courtesy. The lamps offered steady light without ornament, no heroic flicker, no romance. The clock considered. It raised its hand 1 fraction of a breath, then stopped again, a noble delaying a signature he suspects will cost him a nephew. Someone made a mistake. It was not theatrical. No man fell, no rope snapped. A single breath too long, whoever held it will never admit it, and I do not want him to, and the note strayed toward satisfaction. The sky does not forgive satisfaction. The wire shivered. The chalk under my boot made a sound like teeth daring each other to crack. The beast leaned again. This time I felt it in the joints, the old complaint of doors that have been forced to pose as walls. "Take it back," the captain said. And we did, mowing down our own pride as if it were grass-grown disobedient at a cemetery. The choir lowered, disciplined each vowel into honest poverty. We returned 2 seconds to the city like coins that had fallen into our pockets through a hole we should have mended last week. The handless clock pulsed once below us its single permitted declaration. The pulse arrived up through my boots as a ribbon of cold that did not hurt. Then the hinge in the sky opened. The word "opened" is lazy here, but I have no better. Imagine the night remembering a door it had kept quiet about. Imagine the moon's light slipping in a slightly different direction, as if deciding to revisit a childhood street, Between the two gates, a narrow brightness formed the color of bones under a thin hand. The beast adjusted course. It is an animal of habit. Give it a path, and it will use it, especially if the path suggests it was its idea. We paid out wire. We gave the lamps a posture to keep. We sang without joy, without flair, with the dignity of a man sweeping steps in the hour before guests arrive. On a balcony, the child still watched, toy held in the kind of stillness reserved for cats and miracles. On the river, a crease traveled upstream like a signature being practiced. The public clock, for the second time, declined its appointment. Tourists filmed. The city held its breath, the way a widow does when someone knocks. "Now," the captain said, and for the first time in my life I watched men bind the moon with a grammar of respect. At the primary tether, he drew the wire through the crescent and pressed the rosary's gear teeth to the bloodless line the chalk had prepared. He spoke 3 syllables of the halo language, no flourish, no cruelty. The wire answered with a hum that suggested a cat purring in sympathy with a small emergency. At the second tether, I mirrored him, my hands shaking the way hands shake when they are honest about not wanting to be heroic. Across the dome, 2 more watchers made the same knots. On the colonnade, the 3 crescents glowed no brighter than an idea that will not be bullied. The corridor between the gates, held like a bridge, who has met rivers before. The beast entered the ellipse. Time stopped. That sentence embarrasses me for its melodrama and for its accuracy. Movement became grammar without verbs. The square grew so still that memory took photographs of it without asking permission. I watched a droplet hang between fountain lip and basin, considering vocation. The child on the balcony became a painted icon of attention. Even the river, that patient editor of stone, forgot between and settled for still. My body did not freeze. It waited. That's the best I can offer. My breath learned a posture and held it. My chest did the math and decided the solution would be delivered presently. The captain did not blink, because blinking is a kind of confession. The wire in my hand hummed like a field under snow. Somewhere below, the handless clock performed its strange reverse, a fog clearing from the inside, as if time were exhaling to see its own face. We stood like that for what you would call seconds, if seconds had agreed to be counted. The ellipse offered the beast a route. The beast accepted. It is a fussy thing, appetite, but it admires competence. When it had satisfied whatever measure in itself calls this enough, it moved, not up out. The hinge softened, the corridor thinned, the lamps, brave in their utility, kept their posture and declined to gossip. The wire slackened to the amiable dignity of work put away properly. The fountains finished falling. The child's toy completed its journey to the window sill and tapped once, the smallest punctuation mark an evening can offer. The public clock struck. Not loudly. The first stroke is always a throat clearing in a city that thinks it knows itself, but truly, a tone that reconciled the square to its own posture. The pigeons forgave the universe for being complicated. The dogs stood, shook, and trotted off with the ancient confidence of dogs. Tourists laughed the way people do when the safe version of danger has been delivered to them right on time. The men on the colonnade eased their palms from the stone with the care of surgeons ending a case that has argued but not drawn blood. I wanted to cry, not for triumph, for relief. Relief is the most private of public emotions. It makes you human and then sends you home. Reconcile, the captain said. And we began the graceful unmaking that prevents miracles from breeding lawsuits. We took back the ellipse one gate at a time, whispering the apology syllables of the halo language, thanking the air for having played along. We erased crescents from stone with a cloth dipped in warmed wine, returning marble to its chosen anonymity. We coiled wire in loops that would not kink. We instructed the lamps to forget they had opinions. We returned breaths to the choir, seconds to the city, responsibility to the clock. The handless face downstairs fogged one last time, a signature completed with a flourish so discreet you could call it modesty. When all was returned to what the public calls normal, we did what professionals do. We made records. On the roof, with the moon practicing indifference above us, the captain removed a small book from his coat, the size a tailor uses for taking measurements where vanity hides, and wrote the night into it, in lines that would look, to anyone not trained, like recipes. Ellipse held for duration not admitted by registers. Public clock abstained twice, reconciled on third. Wire agreeable, lamps courteous, choir obedient, chalk sufficient, witnesses uninjured, city returned with unsuspicious laughter. He handed me the pencil. I wrote simply, hinge audible. This present, below, in the vault, we entered the ledger of considerations with the dignity of clerks who have buried better men than themselves without believing they deserved it. Debt paid by silence. Collection deferred, the captain added. Return 2 seconds to Via de Banshee at dawn widow's vigil truncated by necessary haste. I added, in the small book that pretended to be my prayer, we tethered a tide and taught it courtesy. God forgive us for being proud of competence. Pride is a luxury we are trained to distrust. It hardens the throat and ruins notes. It draws crescents, too bold for stone to tolerate. We went about the closing rituals with the tenderness of men folding linens after a wake. Candles were snuffed in the exact reverse order of their lighting. Keys behaved. Doors remembered. The night line exhaled. On my way up from the vault, I paused in the stair where centuries have polished the wall to the color of absenteeism. There I met the child from the balcony, now in the corridor because the city has its own ways of inventing permissions for the curious. He was taller at eye level than I had expected, a trick children practice to prepare adults for mortality. He peered into the stairwell and then up at me with the solemnity that makes some men want to become fathers and others want to join the Navy. Did the clock stop? He asked. It forgot, I said. Did you remind it? Was way in Nestri. We helped it remember what it had promised. He nodded in the deep, unconcerned way of the newly initiated. My toy moved slow, he offered. Proof presented like a flower. Good, I said. Slow proves you were present. He thought about that word present, with a concentration that made me suspect he would grow up to be good at one useful thing or at forgiving those who are. Then he ran off. Because childhood is a vigil you shouldn't advance. The captain and I returned to the roof for one last look at the square. Dawn had begun to loan color to the stone. The city resumed its career of being plausible. The map for the night was folded and slid back under the angel's stamp. The chalk cloths lay damp, patient, unpretending. A gull cut the morning with professional rudeness. We breathed like men who have decided there will be other nights. You did well, the captain said, which in our vocabulary means You did not enjoy yourself. It felt like theft, I answered. It was a return, he said. We borrowed stillness from the seconds that can afford it and gave it to a moment that could not. And the beast? It prefers etiquette. Tonight, we were polite. We stood there until the bells agreed with each other. Cathedral, parish. The private bell hung in a courtyard that only rings for brides and fires. The handless clock downstairs cleared its glass as if embarrassed by all the attention. The ledger closed with the soft thud of history pretending to be furniture. If I have told this poorly, forgive me. The truth resists choreography. But understand this: the night Rome stopped, time did not break the city. It revealed her. We learned that our work was not about controlling anything. It was about teaching agreements to hold between breath and stone, between note and wire, between a moon too old for sermons and a morning too fragile for miracles. We return to the rooms men imagine when they hear the words secret archives. We filed our recipes for survival, under headings that will comfort auditors and deceive no one who has ever held a dying hand. We rinsed the warmed wine from the cloths. We blessed the chalk by not wasting it on drawings children could have made better. We returned to the handless clock, each of us pressing a palm to the glass and receiving back the fog that means, this hour behaved. On my way out, I wrote one last line in the private log I keep where the church keeps its awkward children. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the consent of the city to trust us for one more night. We had earned that consent for now. And because you are still with me, and because this is a confession wearing the clothes of a documentary, I owe you the last debt of the chapter, the knowledge that our competence breeds consequences. When you teach a city to pause, it learns the word wait. When you make a habit of forgiving seconds, you discover who has been paying the interest. When you tether a tide with respect, the tide remembers your name. Names matter. Tomorrow, mine will be changed, but first, there is a call to make, and a last chapter to speak, and a torch to pass to a roomful of strangers whose only duty is remarkably human, to remember long enough to ask for better stories than the ones that keep them asleep. I left because the ledger could no longer pretend to be an altar. I did not slam any doors. Men who make noise on their way out are rehearsing an audience they have not earned. I returned my keys one at a time, laying them on a tray that smelled like the hands of 100 sacristans. The brass kept its patience. The tray did not object. I folded my cassock as if I might need it again for a funeral one day, for a wedding I will not be invited to attend, for a vigil in a kitchen where grief has its own clock. Then I walked the Night Line one last time as a citizen of its shadows, and stopped where the wall is polished by the oils of centuries of uncertainty. I placed my palm there and told the stone, softly, I am changing departments. Please remember me, kindly. Leaving a secret does not remove it from your pockets. It leaves lint threads of habit, bits of chalk that reappear in cuffs, the reflex to listen for wire. You will hear it in me still. I speak in ledgers. I breathe in crescents. I prefer competence to confession, until the moment confession becomes the only competence left. The city accepted my silence without questions. Cities are good at that. They have practice. I rented a room on a street that believes it is a hallway between two more important corners, and I learned the hours of the baker and the stubbornness of a window that refuses to open more than it must. The first night away from the vault, I slept like a man who has mailed a letter he cannot unwrite. The second night, I woke at the hour when custodians consider whether to forgive the day for its habits. I lit a candle. It did not slide. It did not point. It behaved. The peace of its obedience frightened me. I began to write. Not the ledger's language, no columns, no crescents in the date, no euphemisms engineer-tested for plausible deniability. I wrote as if a human could read it without training. I wrote in sentences that any grandmother could carry to market without fear of losing her place. I wrote little histories of small mercies paid for with seconds. A widow's vigil returned. A nurse's minute restored. Lamps that chose not to gossip for once. A city that remembered to breathe after being politely asked to wait. I wrote about the cost of weather that is edited for survival. Children's dreams taxed, gardens scolded back to season, brave stories moved to safer months. I wrote about the handless clock, how a palm print can be a verifiable miracle, how fog can be a sacrament if you have trained your throat not to demand thunder. I wrote, most of all, about memory. Not the grand kind that keeps nations hugging their myths, but the tender kind that knows where a teaspoon belongs in a darkened kitchen. Memory is domestic. It smells like soap. It is the smallest candle in the safest corner of a dangerous room. Word leaks the way water does, exactly where it can, all at once, and then not at all. A barber asked why I looked like a man who had just separated from a long employer and a longer habit. A woman on the tram noticed chalk under my nail and said her father had once come home with chalk beneath his and had never explained it. A teacher told me she had begun to leave an extra pause in her lessons, not long enough for chaos, just long enough for someone to think a thought all the way to its end, and asked whether that was a sin. I answered carefully, because care is the discipline that keeps truth from turning into a weapon. It is a sacrament when done without pride. I received letters anonymous, almost. Handwriting that wore disguises, stamps licked by men who distrust even their saliva. Some scolded, some blessed me in ways my old office never managed. A few told me things I would have preferred not to know, where their city keeps its handless clocks, what their lampposts remember, which of their saints had been gently retired in neighborhoods that cannot afford fireworks. The world is not one city. The watch has cousins. Do not be comforted by this. Be tender with it. I refuse to call what follows a manifesto. Manifestos are angry maps that forget people have knees. Think of it as a user manual for an ordinary conscience. An appendix to the documentary you have tolerated. A small torch whose flame has learned to be humble around curtains. What to do with a memory that returns. Practice private accuracy. Buy a paper calendar. Keep it for a year with a pencil. Write down not what the world says the day is, but what you notice it has been. Today the church bell was shy. Today the market hurried me. Today a pause was added to a story I know by heart. Accuracy is not suspicion. It is tenderness that refuses to outsource attention. Keep old maps. Hang them where weather cannot injure them. When you can, warm the surface with your breath and see what rises. Do not attempt the art of erasure without training. Paper has a temper, but do practice the art of looking twice. If a river blushes up from beneath a street, let the knowledge soften the part of you that believes everything recent is correct. Inventory your lamps. This is not mystical. Sit on a stoop and watch 3 in a row at dusk. Learn their personalities. Which one sulks? Which one shows off? Which one is braver than a utility has any right to be? Lamps are municipal, yes, but they are also witnesses. When they dip, do not shout miracle. Note it. Mark the hour. Ask yourself gently, who needed the dip to survive the night? Learn the inexpensive hymn, not because you will tether moons from your apartment window, but because breath held at the right pitch can organize a frightened room. Low A is enough. Practice alone. Practice without joy. Joy is for mornings that did not ask for rescue. Allow saints to be edited without letting them disappear. Names change. Stories migrate. If your city retires a feast, light a quiet candle at home and tell the old story to a plant. Plants are excellent parishioners. They do not argue, and they oxygenate courage. Refuse spectacular anger. It flatters the wrong gods. When you are tempted to rage, convert it into stewardship. Sweep a stair. Pay a debt you owe to no one. Teach a child how to pause without fear. Spectacle breeds surveillance. Steadiness breeds mornings. Cultivate witnesses, not followers. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to test the world. If your candle ever slides, do not start a church. Start a notebook. If your clock ever fogs under your open hand, do not sue it. Thank it for remembering you exist. These are small acts. They are also severe. You will be mistaken for sentimental. You will be accused of seeing patterns in puddles. Accept the ridicule. It is a discount. I will be accused of other things, of blasphemy by those who confuse secrecy with sanctity, of cowardice by those who prefer explosions to invoices, of ingratitude by those who have never met a ledger that did not flatter their version of mercy. I accept those, too, with one correction. I am not ungrateful. I am grateful for competence, and competence has a right to audit its employers. You want villains. Stories like mine are expected to produce them. A prefect with a ring of keys and a grin like an iron hinge. A cardinal whose hobby is puppetry with calendars. A brother whose envy wears a chasuble. I can give you versions of these men, and sometimes I'd like to, but villains simplify what is already survivable. The truth is less handsome. Most of us were good at our jobs and kept what we were good at from becoming cruelty by pretending our paperwork was prayer. Sometimes we failed. Sometimes we called the failure tradition. Tradition can be a balm. It can also be the towel placed over the mirror while a body is prepared. I promised a confession and a call. The confession is this: I loved the work. I loved it in the way mechanics love the car after they've heard what the engine sounds like when it isn't being performed at. I loved the chalk, how a half moon on stone can make arrogance experience a polite fatigue. I loved the handless clock for how honestly it breathed. I loved the captain for his refusal to be heroic. Love is a bias. Count it among my errors. The call is this: do not stop asking questions that are small enough to be answered. Ask your bell, why did you hesitate? Ask your teacher, may we keep this silence? Ask your street, who named you? Ask your calendar, what did you do with Lent when the frost came late? Ask your priest, gently, what does your ledger call mercy this month? Ask your child, what did you dream? Dream is currency. We should know the exchange rate. There are dangers. Curiosity has predators. There are rooms where questions are punished not by answers, but by the removal of doors. I cannot keep you safe. Safety is a rumor sold by men who need your docility. I can make 2 promises: that you will not be alone, and that solitude, when it arrives as it will, can be educated into a useful friend. It will teach you to hear the hinge in the sky when it practices opening. It will teach you to love the posture of a candle that refuses to behave like a flare. If you have listened this far, you have already begun the small rebellion that terrifies every polite empire. You have continued to pay attention after the applause would ordinarily be allowed to tidy the room. The captain and I have not spoken since the night the city practiced eternity. We pass each other sometimes in the square, 2 men studying a fountain as if it were a difficult paragraph. He touches the brim of a hat he was not born to wear. I nod, the universal gesture of men who know the same inconvenient story and prefer not to be seen in the same sentence. I believe he is still paying seconds into accounts the public will never audit. I believe he is still returning minutes to kitchens where grief got trimmed for schedule. I believe the angel still stamps approvals where paper is too arrogant to behave. I have one more note for you. It belongs to no order, owes no debt to a tradition, and has failed every committee that attempted to domesticate it. Silence is not sacred. It is enforced. Memory is not rebellious. It is due. And the most dangerous act, to them, is not disobedience, it is recollection. So here is your candle. Small, undecorated, cheap in a way that will insult the part of you trained by advertisements to equate cost with meaning. Light it, not because a darkness will notice, but because you will. Place your hand over the flame at a distance your skin can afford, and watch the air organize itself around your presence. When you are ready, and only then, place your palm on the face of any clock you trust. If it fogs, you have not conjured a miracle. You have kept a promise for which you were born equipped, to verify that time and breath still consent to each other where you live. If you walk past a church and smell iron and prayer, do not be brave for sport, but do not lie to yourself. Admit the door with dying moons exists, even if you never open it. Teach your children to draw small crescents on paper, not doodles of war. If a choir holds a note, a heartbeat too long, close your eyes and imagine a wire humming along a roof you cannot see. Consider the possibility that competence is a kind of hope we do not have the language to bless. Now we arrive at the line, "I was warned never to cross," addressing you directly, not as a penitent, not as a parishioner, as a neighbor who believes mornings are worth earning. Do not stop asking questions. Do not surrender the seconds that belong to you. Do not trade your memory for a schedule that flatters no one worth loving. Write down what the day tried to erase. Keep a private calendar. Save old maps. Notice which saints lose their days and which stories grow shorter each time they are told. Hand your child a pencil and ask them to draw the street as it feels, not as it is sold. If the room begins to tilt, if you hear a page turn when I am silent, if the lamps lean their heads as if listening, if a latch moves somewhere above the roofline of your understanding good, that is the world remembering you remember it. That is the ledger, discovering it cannot afford you as a debtor any longer. That is the angel signing off on your small audit with a stamp no one will see, but everyone will benefit from. This is a story for sleep, not because it is dull, but because sleep is where memory rehearses courage without the embarrassment of an audience. When you wake, let the courage be quiet. Quiet is not weakness. Quiet is grip. Quiet is how roofs do their work. Quiet is how a city learns the oldest blessing, to be ordinary after surviving a night that insisted on being interesting. I will put down my pen now. The candle is steady. A child somewhere is practicing being present with a toy on a windowsill. A clock somewhere else fogs beneath a hand that has no idea it has just performed a sacrament. The ledger waits for better accountants. The wire hums in a dream that is teaching itself to prefer gentleness over drama. Don't stop asking questions, because the most dangerous thing to them is your memory. Waking up, and once it's awake, it will keep watch with you through every silent night.